Hello and welcome to the fourth of our Bedrock interviews with our contributors, where we sit down with them over a cup of tea to get to know them a bit. Today we're joined by Laura Calnan, who wrote a wonderful article for our March issue all about Julian of Norwich and her own experiences in dealing with suffering. This is just a reminder before we get into the interview that our June issue has now come out, and you can pick it up by subscribing on our website, which we'll put a link in the description. So make sure you get a copy of that if you haven't already. This time we actually have 15 authors as opposed to the 12 we had in the March issue, because of just the number of people who've wanted to write for us and who've sent in great pictures. So make sure you pick up a copy of that and let's get cracking. So Laura, lovely to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
When did you start getting interested in Julian of Norwich, that you wrote this sort of great article about and that you're now studying? How did that kind of interest arise?
It sort of in a fairly organic way, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I did history as an undergraduate, and in my third year of my undergraduate degree, I did that in Edinburgh, so it was 4 years long. Mm-hmm. I was doing a course on how biography is used or can be used by historians. And one of my initial essays for that course was about, I ended up choosing a biography of Hildegard of Bingen, another medieval mystic, because I was really intrigued by how a biographer would go about dealing with something as strange as a mystical experience. And then that essay developed into a broader kind of project about mystics in general. I did look at a biography of Julian of Norwich, which actually wasn't very good. Mm-hmm. But then I returned to women mystics during the medieval period for my undergraduate dissertation. Mm-hmm. And Julian was one of those. I used her especially when I was talking about, I had one chapter on humility, which then became my doctoral project. But that's really how I got into Julian. Wonderful,
wonderful. And you write in your article about your own experiences with suffering and with illness, and kind of how you felt you could maybe relate to Julian of Norwich a bit more through those. How did this sort of your own illness or sort of weakness, how did that help you to understand her writings better, do you think, or who she was?
It was, again, I think just because of how the symptoms of my condition arose and the timeline of it, it all sort of came about around the summer between my third year and my fourth year of my undergraduate degree. So whilst I was developing the symptoms, I was also writing this dissertation. So I started to think about women mystics sort of in relation to what I was going through. So yes, that was quite a natural thing, but the reason for it was that I realised that these were people who were having unusual experiences and were then having to go about explaining to the world exactly how those experiences worked. And I found that there was a sense of solidarity in that. My condition is a very rare one. I've never met anybody else with it. And being taken seriously took quite a while. It took several months to get an X-ray, at which point the problem became very clear. But before that, I did have to face people telling me that maybe if I hadn't been diagnosed yet, there was nothing wrong. None of the symptoms quite matched up to sort of more well-known conditions. And then even after I was diagnosed, I found that you have to kind of walk a very fine line between truth and strategy when it comes to actually getting proper disability support and things. You've got to be honest about what's going on with you, but you do have to present that truth in a very particular way. And those kinds of questions, whilst they're relevant for people facing illnesses and disabilities, also really cut to the heart of what interested me about Christian mysticism. So given that I was looking at them and finding strange parallels between their lives and mine, when I then went in for surgery about a year and a half later, thinking about them again did sort of come naturally once more. And I found that with going through surgery is it's quite a scary thing. And then when you're faced with much more suffering than you anticipated going through, you can end up feeling quite lost and almost scrabbling around looking for a way to deal with it. And I found that there wasn't really any decent material out there, in terms of articles or whatever, about how to accept suffering and receive help properly in a way that might help you to survive and to grow as a person. If you look it up, for example, if you look up, how to receive mercy, you'll automatically be directed towards how to give it. But then nobody tells you what to do when you are the one who has to receive it. Or even if they do, it can very quickly be turned into, an almost sort of a triumphant story that looks back and talks about how great everything is now, but again doesn't walk you through the everyday reality of little humiliations and feeling like you really are a burden, and the suffering that you're going through is a burden in and of itself. But Julian, out of all of the mystics I look at, treats those particular subjects with real sensitivity and contemplates them quite carefully. As I say in the article, she starts having mystical experiences or visions while she's extremely ill and thinks that she's going to die. So after getting better, she writes an initial text, which she calls the short text, and she writes down all of these visions. And we think that maybe that text was then used to apply to become an anchoress, when an anchoress is somebody who sort of lives in a cell, sort of adjacent to a church and doesn't really come out again. Right. But she had to apply to her bishop to be able to do that. And it's possible that she wrote to him and said, okay, look, I was ill and I had these experiences, so please can I go and live this extraordinary way of life? But then years later, she comes back to reflect on those experiences a lot more carefully. And this is probably decades later. And I really liked that, because she experiences very serious suffering. And in fact, the whole context of Julian, she's sort of like 14th, 15th century. Historically, the plague has just transformed society in very serious ways. She's come close to dying herself, and she doesn't necessarily present direct answers immediately. She contemplates her suffering slowly, and then step by step, she finds that meaning is gradually revealed. And I found that was I think quite an effective way of dealing with pain as and when it comes.
That's beautiful. And I suppose that sense of commonality down the ages of two people in very similar situations must be quite powerful, right? That you sort of feel like that's someone else has gone through this and is thinking about it in the same way that you are now. Well, maybe on the flip side of that, as you mentioned, she was living in the Middle Ages, 14th, 15th century. She's an anchoress. She's ends up walled in sort of to this church. She's very much living in a very different cultural context to us nowadays. Was there anything from that when you were reading Julian of Norwich that particularly surprised you or shocked you, that made you think, actually, I've got, why on earth is she writing this? This makes no sense, in addition to all the many things which did resonate?
Well, I think, to be honest with you, when you're reading mysticism, like mystical texts, a lot of the stuff in there can be a bit shocking. So they think the religious tradition of the time in and of itself doesn't shy away from sort of more graphic descriptions of suffering, for example, that really make us quite uncomfortable today. And Julian is the most tame of the mystics I look at, but she'll really go into detail about red blood or gaping side wounds and that sort of thing. And that can take a while to get used to, or even the idea that you might, this is somebody who's already suffered tremendously, whose whole society has just suffered tremendously. And yet, even before her illness, she's asking to suffer more. I found this absolutely astounding, I think.
Wow, so she was actually asking for
She was
suffering.
asking for suffering. Though unlike other mystics, what you do get with some mystics is some fairly questionable practices where they impose suffering on themselves. You don't see Julian doing that. For her, it's much more about accepting suffering if and as and when it comes.
Yeah, and I suppose if reading her as someone going through a lot of suffering, that must be quite a shock. Thinking like, why on earth would you ask her this?
Exactly. Yeah. Why would you do that to yourself?
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh. I mean, that's so interesting. Another thing that I'd like to touch on then is what you were. What you wrote about in your article in terms of your family and the way that you found you were in the middle of this kind of condition and the suffering. You found that your family was a real support in that and in their generosity. What role do you think kind of family in general, and I suppose any kind of strong community in particular, has for supporting people who are particularly vulnerable, either at a particular moment or sort of more generally in our society?
Well, I think that they're tremendously important. In that, if a family or a community are able to support sort of their weaker members well, it allows for a reaffirmation, I think, of the dignity of those people who are suffering. Because when you are on the receiving end of the suffering itself, you're deeply aware of how annoying you are, frankly.
Yeah.
So for me, I mean, initially, in being diagnosed with the condition, I wasn't too bad in that I was just not helpful anymore. I couldn't do things. But then post-surgery, it was like, well, not only was I not adding anything to my family or my community, but I needed them to do extra things for me. And I'd gone through, most of my life, but especially my adult life with this sense that, and it's not a wrong idea, of course, it's an important one, but if you're going to live a good life, you should serve your community. And I really believed in working with your hands in doing that. And that idea came from, I was sort of raised to make myself useful. So when I got to university, I found, I signed up to do lots of volunteering and helping out with student societies and things like that. And that's a good thing, because helping people, whether they're more vulnerable, whether they're facing poverty or illness, or even if it's people who are new to your community and need help settling in, that does you a lot of good. It helped me out because I was quite shy, and I found that doing things like washing up or cleaning or being put in a position where I was helping to welcome people brought me out of myself. In a certain sense, it allowed me to meet people and receive kindness by offering it in the first place. So families and communities do themselves good, I think, when they help others. But then, sort of post-surgery, I then had to ask myself, even post-diagnosis, but especially post-surgery, I really did have to confront this question of what is it that really does give me my dignity and my value? Am I useless now that I can't do anything? And I knew that the answer was no, but I had to find some sort of justification for that. And I found it in the way that really my value was reflected in the gaze of the people helping me. I knew I had dignity because I was loved, and I was worth loving. Partly, just because I'm a human being, but I am part of a family. I am part of a community. So in them seeing me more clearly and seeing my needs more clearly, I started to see their goodness far more than I had before.
That's beautiful. And I think possibly one of the things I find most beautiful about that testimony and experience is that nowadays it's very easy, I think, for especially in the current political climate, for people to use suffering as a reason for denying people's dignity or value to, maybe not dignity explicitly, but value to society.
Exactly, yeah.
Reaffirming that they're useless, just like in the UK, last month with this vote we had to legalise euthanasia in the House of Commons, and a lot of these arguments were being pushed. In a way, it's quite beautiful to have this sort of testimony of the value of each individual in the middle of that suffering. Right?
Exactly, yes.
And I think it's especially beautiful that obviously you had that supportive family community to surround you with affection and with help. And as a result, you could sort of almost work on showing gratitude to them. And I think one of the things I loved about your article is that you talk a lot about gratitude and what gratitude means to you. And I think we can agree it's something that it's good for all of us to cultivate. There's a long-winded way of saying, for those people who perhaps feel like they haven't had that support or that generosity of people around them, but who still maybe want to cultivate gratitude, or who feel like they can't for whatever reason, do you have anything to say to how you can cultivate gratitude even when you don't have such an obvious help that you're grateful for?
Yes, and it is quite a delicate question, I think, because it really does depend on what it is that people are going through. One thing I think I did say before, is that suffering is inherently isolating. You do feel like you're alone. And sometimes you really are, and it just ends up highlighting that. And whilst I did have help, it's that there were certain instances where there have been instances, especially immediately, pre-diagnosis and post-diagnosis, where I had to advocate for the help. Because at that point it wasn't necessarily about my family doing things for me. It was that, for me, I'd reached such a point physically in my final year of undergraduate that by the time I was diagnosed, I knew that if I didn't get proper disability support and things like dictation software put in, I was going to fail my degree. But when I initially reached out, what happened was I was just put on a very, very long waiting list. I went to, I emailed, would get no response. And then I was sort of thrown back and forth between the disability service at the university and student support, and nobody particularly wanted to deal with me because no one was really willing to get the ball rolling. And I found that I just had to consistently show up and be like, I'm going to fail if you don't help me out now, because I physically can't do the work. So, and that's absolutely exhausting. When you feel like there's nobody there to help you. And I remember even thinking about, later on, I talked briefly in the article about the woman in the bed next to mine the morning after I had my surgery. The thing is, she definitely had less help than me. I remember when I sat down next to her, I said to her, well, do you live with anybody? And she said, no, I live alone. And I said, do you have any family? And she said, yes, but my daughter works. I don't know how I'm going to cope. I just don't know. And her daughter did immediately take the day off work to go and look after her mother. But I don't know what her support later on did look like. I think if the suffering that you're facing is a particular physical condition, and say if you don't have family around you, if you are receiving anything at all, whether that's support from a carer or an at-home nurse or something. Fortunately or unfortunately, you just have to focus on that one thing, the very, very small things, because that's a tremendous part of it. In the initial stages, I think, after suffering that comes as a massive shock, or even as it develops slowly, I found that deep suffering it does two things. The first is that it sort of makes you brace yourself. You think, okay, well, I've got to get through this somehow. And that, in the long term, can either make you stronger or it can make you extremely brittle. And brittle because the second thing that happens to you is that in response to that shock, you pretty much end up closing yourself off and thinking, okay, well, and retreating into your own head because you don't know how to deal. And that's very much what happened to me after surgery, and it's why I really started to think about Julian so carefully. It's because I realised that if I was going to get through this and come out still being a person that I actually liked, I was going to have to be quite disciplined with myself in the way that I thought about it. So, looking at what happened to me, sure, I was never going to die. I wasn't even technically sick, and my suffering could have been far worse than it was. But my life could also have been a lot easier. So when I received my diagnosis, I was 21, and that's a stage at which you're really coming into your own independence. So to then be sat down and told, okay, look, your life isn't going to look the way you thought it was, and you're going to have to depend on people just as you've learned to really relish this independence that you've got. It's quite a hard blow. And you can focus on that to the point where, you do get yourself into this loop where you're stuck inside your own head and feeling sorry for yourself. Or you can force yourself to come out and look around for tiny, tiny things. And it's usually those tiny things that are the most helpful with gratitude, because sure, you can say, I'm grateful to be alive or whatever, but that's not what's going to make you feel better. But small kindnesses. So I even got a shock when I learned that I was going to have nurses visiting me at home every few days after my surgery. I hadn't realised that was necessary, but they did have to come to clean my bandages and so on. And I loved it when the at-home nurses came because, it was August and it was really, really hot. So being underneath all of these bandages was rough. But I remember them coming, and then, they'd clean my hand for me, and just how fresh that felt, being cleaned up properly. And some of the nurses were nicer than others, but their small kindnesses made such a difference to me. And if you are ill, you should hopefully have that kind of support from somebody. Or if you're at a point where you're turning around and you're like, I really need help, even if you're having to ask for help, someone eventually will. Someone will help you if you ask enough. And then I'd say really focus on it when you do, very intensely. You can almost contemplate it over and over again. And then you'll discover once more, I think, that the world is bigger than you, and the suffering that you're facing. I think that's one small way to help.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much. And I really like that emphasis on focus, that you even if nothing around you changes, the way you look at things does, because you choose what you're really kind of paying attention to, and it's the good things, it's the actions of generosity. And yet you'll still find perhaps people who maybe can see all the generosity around them and feel like they're being helped by so many people, and yet they feel that their suffering is so intense that even having all this sort of all this lavishness of friends or family or support or what have you just isn't helping them to deal with their suffering, but it's just making them more and more bitter. What do you have any words for people like that?
Yes. Again, I do want to tread carefully because I mean, talking about that it is such a difficult thing to go through.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes in talking about suffering, you know, I was conscious of it when I was writing the article. I'm conscious of it now. If you rush towards finding positivity or meaning in suffering, you're just going to end up hating yourself, quite frankly, if you can't find it. And I think that's where Julian can help, I think, or, well, even, I tend to find it's something I quite like about medieval sort of meditative devotion, which I'm working on at the moment. I like that because it takes the experience of suffering extremely seriously. So, you know, whether you're religious or not, in this case, you know, I read this stuff as, you know, I read it academically, but some of the devotional texts I've been looking at recently are meditations on the life of Christ, and the author Bonaventure goes through these meticulously, and I've just talked about focusing on the positives, but he really focuses on the serious negatives. Whether that's the heat or the dust when Christ is travelling somewhere as a child, or the weight of the cross or the nails later on. He and Julian, like him, take the time to just think about how horrendous that is. Because, yeah, the truth is that suffering does have the capacity to break you. At the end of the day, for most of us, for all of us, it is going to break us all physically, ultimately. And it can break you mentally far before that happens. So be serious about that. Because it's only in acknowledging the reality of what you're going through that you have any chance of getting through it. So, well, for myself, the first thing I did in thinking about Julian after surgery, it wasn't really so much that I could find meaning in suffering, or even just practice gratitude because it's a good thing to do. I couldn't even think that far ahead. I was just trying to survive and not end up being almost eaten alive, I think, in an interior sense, by what I was going through. So I think it's important to be patient with yourself and then wait slowly for things to unfold. Because you're not going to find meaning in scrabbling around for it. Suffering it's quite a mysterious thing. You don't get to choose what comes your way. Ultimately, you've just got to accept it. So I think if you are struggling with, feeling somehow removed or isolated from the people who are being kind to you, that's all right. Accept it, and accept the fact that you can't. Just like you can't control whatever it is that's just happened to you, you might not initially be able to control your response to it. That takes time. I think that really is important. And then gradually something will shift just by practicing that kind of detachment and that acceptance of the fact that you're in a really difficult situation and you have to relinquish control. So beating yourself up about how you feel, it's not going to help you, and it's not going to help anybody who's helping you. So I think if you are feeling isolated from, the people around you, the people who are trying to help you, accept that fact first, because that's all right. And just as you can't necessarily control, well, in fact, you couldn't control whatever it is that has happened to you. In the initial stages, you're not going to be able to control your feelings or your response either. So I think sit in it and be patient with it. It's something that Julian herself sort of seems to be recommending doing. In her own writing, she has this little parable where so it's a master and a servant in a fairly typical biblical fashion. Mm-hmm. And the servant sort of rushes ahead of his master to go and do his will, because he's so devoted to his master. But in rushing ahead like that, he falls into a ditch and gets seriously hurt. And for Julian, she says that there are 7 stages to his suffering. And the initial stages are, the bruises and the cuts and, the fact that he's feeling a bit dazed and so on. But the 7th stage, and the deepest and the most important one, is that he just feels totally alone in that suffering. So technically he knows his master is there, his master is coming, but he has this sense that there is no one. And Julian makes a lot of space for that. She doesn't condemn that. She says it's an important part of suffering well. It's taking it. So, yeah, I think, accept that, yes, you are isolated and you are lonely, but you're also sort of, if you are aware that there are people around you, remember that you're feeling a certain way, but your suffering because you need others is not just about you. Mm. So, in your isolation, again, contemplate one thing. Maybe it's somebody and the smaller things, again, work best. Maybe somebody's brought you a cup of tea. Maybe somebody has said something kind to you. Focus on that one thing, and even do one thing a day. Mm. And I hope gradually you will end up coming out of the mist.
Mm. Wonderful. And maybe something that's particularly meaningful about what you've shared, and maybe what you found in Julian as well, is that it's talking about your own experiences rather than trying to give a sort of like step-by-step how to drag yourself up by your bootlaces out of your suffering. I think any of us who've experienced any kind of suffering know that that's the last thing you want to hear in that situation.
Exactly, yeah.
But sharing a friend or a friend or family member sharing something with us about their own experience of that is potentially so much more powerful. So thank you very much. Is there anything else while we're on Julian? Is there anything else you read in sort of Julian of Norwich? I particularly like that that sort of story about the master and the servant that you found particularly striking or beautiful, or has impacted your life.
Yes. So Julian. One thing I love about Julian is how much she focuses on the idea of littleness or smallness and fragility as things that are inherently precious. I think that ties in quite well with what we were just talking about, the danger of, or the reality sometimes of, beating yourself up about how you're feeling, or the impact you're having on other people, or your own inability sometimes to feel or to see goodness around you. Julian's whole conception of reality, of the whole of creation, is sort of summarised early on in her writings. She has a vision of it's a tiny thing, sort of. It's the size of a hazelnut and even more fragile than a hazelnut. And she looks at it, and it looks like it's about to disintegrate pretty much. And she says, how can this tiny thing, this tiny fragile thing, remain in existence without disintegrating? And the answer she hears to that is is because God loves it. And again, it doesn't, I don't think it, I think you can find meaning in that no matter what you believe. Because you are loved. And you're loved partly, well, very much in your fragility. Because the reality is that all of us are fragile. None of it, the control that we have over our own lives is, it's something that we think we have, and then the further life progresses, the more that ends up being stripped away. I really love the idea that fragility is in and of itself worth loving and worth caring for. But something that she also sort of proposes in her writings is that, so of course you have God and supreme goodness as something great or big, and then us as the created beings as small. But she sees, bad things and evil as even smaller than that. And so she's got this one passage that I was reading a few months ago, where you've got the Virgin Mary having a bit of a confrontation with the devil. And you'd think that, this would be this great heroic sort of standoff between the two, but Mary actually just finds him funny. So she laughs at him, and Julian's here just watching the scene. And because Mary finds him funny, she finds him funny too. And I think that is, I find that so helpful. Because I have found over the past few years since my diagnosis that sometimes the best thing you can do when something goes wrong, so for me, one of the side effects of this is that I've ended up being quite clumsy. I drop things, I break things, and I need to ask people for things. I take time to, sometimes it takes me more time to say, get my card out of my purse, and you've got people behind you, and you're being annoying by holding them all up. You can either think, oh my goodness, I know I'm winding everybody up here, or you can actually turn around and acknowledge the situation and be funny about it, because it diffuses the tension. If you've owned it, and not only that, but you're funny about it, nobody can really stay annoyed at you anymore. And it also it helps you not to take yourself too seriously. Me dropping my fork during a meal, it's quite funny. Humiliating, yes, because the last time I had an excuse to do that was when I was like, I don't know, 3, 4. But it's just life, and accepting that, that's quite funny. It means that facing sustained suffering in any way it's not so much of a burden anymore.
Wonderful. And I suppose almost that kind of having a sense of humour it's almost the opposite of something like, say, cynicism, where you find the negative things, the sort of powerful, serious ones, and the positive side of things is always something to be seen through or not really taken seriously. It's almost a kind of flipping that, isn't it?
Exactly.
The positive things are the things we focus on because they're the serious ones, and the negative things, well, it's just ridiculous, that's just funny.
Exactly.
Which is very beautiful. Okay.
Thank you.
Lovely. Well, I think we're nearing the end of our interview now. Do you have any final tips for our listeners as to if they feel like they've now started, suffering is something we all experience, and it's something we can all potentially use to cultivate a sense of gratitude. Do you have any final words for people who maybe might want to start doing that, whether that's in the little annoyances of every day or something more serious like you had?
I have a little think about that. It's really the main piece of advice that I have is just to reiterate what I've really been saying, I think, throughout this whole interview. It's that the little things really are the most important things. So focus on those. And then, if it is a big thing, take what you're going through seriously, because it is important. But as you're taking it seriously, don't take yourself too seriously. Mm-hmm. That's all I'd say.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Laura. Well, thank you very much for listening. Just to reiterate, if you'd like to read Laura's article, you can pick up a copy of our March issue on our website. If you subscribe, you'll get a copy of the second Bedrock issue that came out in June. And hopefully this is something which has inspired some of you, just as it has me, to find more meaning in the middle of my suffering. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you.